Welcome back, everybody, to more from the Sable Eyes. I'm here today with Jordan. How are we doing, Jordan?
I'm doing well, thank you.
That is good, and we are here to run through another ReshiZard Charizard list, this time the Greens version. Over our testing, I think, Jordan, we've probably come to the conclusion that the Greens version of this list might potentially be better than the Jirachi one.
It's really hard to say because they're so different in my opinion. I mean, obviously the Jirachi one has access to cards like Salazzle and Ninetales, which just have busted abilities in my opinion. And Jirachi, of course, has a pretty busted ability of its own, but it's hard to argue with the Greens build just having so many utility cards you can search for when you need to. It really swings some of its matchups in a way that the Jirachi build can't.
Yeah, there's lots going on for this deck, and the thing that I really like about it is the consistency at which you can power up Double Blaze, not just for the GX attack, but for the full 300 damage. And we'll run through the reasons why. Our first reason is that we play 4 copies of Baby Volcanion in this list. Flare Starter is absolutely insane when you go second, attaching 3 energy to any Pokemon that you like, or any one Pokemon, is just a stupid effect of an attack. But even when you're going first, the ability to just continue to accelerate energy, especially with some of the decks that we're playing against being quite slow, is quite powerful.
And it does have second attack High Heat Blast, which isn't that great. I mean, it's not as good as it used to be when Zapdos was a top tier deck, but it is still nice having a fairly decent non-GX attack that you can pull off. But it's mainly there, obviously, for that turn 1 when you're going second. If you open with Volcanion, get a turn 1 Flare Starter off, you're in a pretty good position. And spoiler alert, this Volcanion makes up over 50% of the basics in this list.
It certainly does. We only actually play 7. We've got 3 copies of ReshiZard, so you're likely to start with that Volcanion when you need to. Another thing on High Heat Blast, just before we start talking about ReshiZard, High Heat Blast is really good for trying to swing prize trades, especially against other tag team GX decks, like maybe you're going up against Mew 3 or Pikarom or whatever it is. You can High Heat Blast, even for the basic 50, to let your ReshiZard come in and take a one-shot knockout, and that way you can potentially just attack 3 times and win the game, which is pretty crazy. But let's talk about ReshiZard Charizard and the reason that it is so powerful. It has Outrage for 2 energy, 2 fire energy in this deck, 1 fire, 1 colorless, Outrage 30 plus the amount of damage that's been done to this ReshiZard. And lots of Pokemon are actually going to struggle to one-shot it, Jordan, so Outrage is a very potent attack.
Certainly is. In fact, I would probably say that the fact that this card has 270 HP, in my opinion, is probably the best factor about this card in general, just because it's not going to be taking one-hit KOs relatively consistently and almost never being one-hit KO'd in return. So Outrage all of a sudden becomes a really good attack for trading with your opponent.
Yeah, and if you can't get an Outrage off, then for 4 energy, 3 fire and a colorless, you have the option to Flare Strike. It's not quite as powerful as it used to be. Obviously, Choice Band made 260 damage rather than 230, but 230 is still really strong, and with some little chip damage here or there from your Volcanion, or potentially even a bit of luck, you're probably going to be taking knockouts with Flare Strike pretty regularly. The obvious downside is that you can't use Flare Strike again next turn, but in reality, you probably don't want to. You're either going to use Double Blaze GX or just Outrage.
Yeah, the Flare Strike basically is going to be knocking out anything in the format except for tag team Pokemon, but that's why it complements so well with the Double Blaze GX, because as you were mentioning before, it's not too hard to get to 6 energy realistically in this deck, so if you ever have a tag team that you want to take a knockout on, you can just power up for that 6 energy Double Blaze GX and take a one-hit KO like that.
Yeah, and when you think about it, with Volcanion and Reshiram in conjunction together, if you're going second, it's not unrealistic for you to be double blazing for 300 on your second turn of attacking, turn 4 of the game. Because I mean, you Flare Starter and attach 3. Maybe you've got an extra attachment or 2 in hand for next turn and a Welder, and suddenly Double Blaze is super powerful. So please, do not discount this card because it's probably the fastest deck to take one-shots. The key is going to be making sure that we can maintain those one-shots, and so we're going to try and do that through the 2 supporters that we run. The first one is obviously very important. It's a fire deck, so we're going to be running 4 copies of Welder. We're going to be able to attach up to 2 energy from our hand and then draw 3 cards. This card obviously means that both ReshiZard and Volcanion can be potentially powered up in a single turn.
It's pretty crazy to think that this is the only draw supporter in this deck, and it's not a deck that has like a whole bunch of abilities to let you draw cards. It's literally this welder is realistically the only way that this deck's going to be drawing cards, but you don't really need to find that many cards because as long as you've got Welder and Fire Energy in your hand and you're attacking with ReshiZard, you're probably doing pretty well in that game. And anything else that you need, you probably don't need to draw because you'll be able to search it out with the next card we're about to talk about.
Yeah, 4 copies of Green's Exploration. These are the only 2 supporters that we run in the list. I know Matt played in the previous video where he played ReshiZard, played like a Judge and a Surgeon. You can play those cards as well. We've opted to just cut it back for the deck profile just to make it as consistent as possible. Greens is busted in this deck. You can search out 2 custom catches to take a knockout on exactly what you want. You can search out a fire-based stadium, either to draw cards or to search out energy. You can draw healing cards with Green's Exploration. It's almost endless, the combination of cards that you can pick up, and it makes ReshiZard not just a potent attacker, but also a card that's really, really difficult to 2-hit knockout.
Yeah, it's really powerful, the fact that this deck can run cards like Custom Catcher really easily, and Mixed Herbs as well, as cards that realistically aren't easy to get like working consistently. And the fact that this deck's playing both of those cards really shows how powerful Greens is. And with not a single ability in this list, Greens is always going to be active. So you can even use Greens to chain into other Greens if you're feeling a bit lucky there. But most of the time, you'll be wanting to use Welder and Greens kind of consecutively.
Yeah, you were kind of one turn after another. And the way we're going to try and help ourselves do that, I figured I'd put this on the supporter slide since there are no others, is Pokegear 3.0. This is just an extra little consistency card to help you get into one of the 2 supporters that you need. It's not uncommon for you to search for one with Greens or to draw into one off of Welder, but sometimes you just need that extra little push, and in 7 cards you're usually going to find a supporter that is of use. Obviously it's a bit of a risk only having the Pokegear here. We could potentially add in some extras just to make it a little bit more consistent to play supporters, but realistically these are the 2 ones we want to play, so we may as well play them.
Yeah, Pokegear basically just increases the counts of the other supporters in your list. Obviously, you're not allowed to play more than 4 copies of Welder or Greens, but Pokegear is the next closest thing to playing more than 4 copies, and there really isn't many other supporters that are worth playing. We did mention the Surge before, which I'm a big fan of because it allows you to Greens for a Welder and then play it straight away, for example, but for the most part, you're going to be fine with just playing Greens or Welder every turn, so the Pokegear is going to allow you to do that relatively consistently.
Yeah, exactly, and I mean, even if you don't play a supporter for a turn, if you've got a powered up attacker, then you're perfectly fine to attack with it. Even if you're just using Volcanion to set up another energy on the bench, it's probably not a big deal. Because, I mean, realistically, you can afford to lose 2 Volcanion before your ReshiZard come in, and your opponent still has to knock out the same amount of tag teams. So that's a possible strategy if you're going for it. Onto the items, we are starting off with 4 copies of Cherish Ball. This deck doesn't play any ways of searching out Volcanion. You just kind of have to hope that you start with it at the moment. And I'd say that's probably one of the big weaknesses of the list. You can't just Greens for a Volcanion, but I mean, Pokemon communications isn't going to be particularly strong. You've only got 7 Pokemon, and there's no other realistic ways we can search for Volcanion, so we figured, we'll just use the 4 Cherish Ball, and I mean, we've got a 4 in 7 chance of starting Volcanion, so we'll just ride those odds until eventually we get going.
Yeah, the Volcanion, you don't always need it. Like, it's good to open with it. It's really strong if you do open with it going second, but a lot of the time, all you need is a ReshiZard, a backup ReshiZard, and a Welder, and you can just start attacking for pretty much the entire game, and maybe even never needing to use Volcanion at all. So the Cherish Ball is basically just going to kind of make sure that you don't get benched down and give you a way to search for Pokemon in Greens.
Yeah, give those attackers a place to be searched with. The rest of the items are actually, I'm just looking through them here, they're mostly all 4 odds. We've got 4 Custom Catcher. This is obviously so that we can play 2 at a time to bring out whatever we want. This is, like we were speaking about when we were talking about Greens, one of the real big positives of the deck. I'd say ReshiZard is the most likely deck to be gusting out targets in the early game, just because it's so easy to do. If you go second and you manage to use Volcanion, and then maybe you've got an extra attachment, you could very easily custom catcher out something like a Dedenne, or maybe even a GX Pokemon that's being powered up on the bench, and take 2 early prizes and that can really stifle your opponent when they're not able to set up the way that they want to.
It's kind of hard to argue with the efficiency of the Jirachi Ninetales engine being able to gust almost every single turn in the game, but the Custom Catcher Greens engine is not much far behind it. Like, you can realistically gust any turn of the game you want to. Maybe not every turn, but you can find it really easy when you do need it. And this is the kind of deck that probably only needs to do it once or twice before you've just won the game. So it's also useful just for a little bit of card draw, because this deck is lacking a bit in draw power, but for the most part, you're not going to need to do that. You're just going to want to search for them greens and put yourself in a good position.
Yeah, we do forget that sometimes sometimes you are able to use this card for its one card effect, which is to draw until you have 3, and sometimes that's just enough. The next card is another kind of 4 of play 2 card. That's Mixed Herb, and this one's first ability is going to be able to get you out of some really clutch situations. I don't know about you, Jordan, but I've noticed that lots of decks are playing things like paralysis or sleep in order to stall out turns, and you have to find switches or whatever it is. The cool thing about Mixed Herbs is if you play one, that status condition is gone, so you don't need to worry about getting paralyzed locked into the active. And if you play 2 of them, you get rid of the status condition and you also heal 90 damage, which means that ReshiZard isn't just a really potent attacker, but is also an exceptionally tanky boy.
Yeah, when I think of ReshiZard, I always think that it's like the biggest one-hit machine in the format overall. Like, if you ever go up in a matchup where it's just GX versus GX, ReshiZard's usually going to come out on top, but it's really the non-GX matchups where they're able to take these half-hit KOs and force you to take inefficient prizes, which ReshiZard tends to struggle with. But Mixed Herbs gives you a really good game plan against those kinds of decks, because if they're relying on 2-hit KOs and you're able to heal majority of the damage off every turn, they're really not going to have much they can do besides trying to get a 1-hit, and it's really hard to win a 1-hit war against ReshiZard.
It certainly is, and we've also got 4 copies of another healing card. It's a Great Potion, which is able to heal 50 damage off of a ReshiZard as well, so you can potentially get rid of entire hits worth of damage. One Mixed Herb and a potion here is going to get rid of an entire Giratina's attack, which is quite frightening. You're going to be able to withstand possibly 4 hits, maybe even 5 if you can get another healing card before that Giratina is going to be able to take a knockout. So it means that Green's ReshiZard is going to stay in, or the ReshiZard itself is going to stay in play a long, long time.
And what's really strong about that is, usually when you're playing ReshiZard, you're wanting to use Walder a lot of the time, but if you use greens to heal your ReshiZard, you're keeping the energy in play in theory, because they're not knocking you out. So using a greens is almost the same as using a welder, because it's going to make sure you've got a healthy ReshiZard ready to go.
Yeah, and it's going to try and bait out their big GX attackers into the active. The only way that decks can realistically deal with it in one shot is by using their own one-shot machine. So if you're playing Malamar, you're going to need to put Ultra Necrozma or something like that, maybe even a Giratina Garchomp tag team into the active, and once that's done, you can attack with Reshiram Charizard on the bench in order to take a knockout, so you can kind of bait those big attackers out. Sometimes you are going to get yourself stuck into the active, and that can be quite frustrating, especially if you need to Flare Strike twice in a row. So we have 2 copies of Switch. It's really good because you can search it out with greens, and usually you're happy to just switch out of one ReshiZard into another and start attacking with Flare Strike. But in a pinch, you can also attack with Volcanion and just start preparing new ReshiZards on the bench whilst your opponent tries to find a way to knock one out.
And just in general, Switch is a useful card for if you've got a damaged ReshiZard in the active and you can't heal quite enough to keep it out of danger. You might be better off just switching to the bench and using Welder to power up another ReshiZard, and then you can keep that damaged one on the bench safe until you find enough healing cards to bring it active again. It means you're not having to waste a whole bunch of energy, and you really don't want to force yourself to use more welders than you need to.
Yeah, exactly. Those welders need to be of value, and one of the ways we're going to try and make them valuable is by playing 3 copies of Fire Crystal. Obviously, sometimes you do have to discard energy. Maybe you're retreating from a Volcanion in order to start attacking with a Reshiram. Maybe one of your Pokemon gets knocked out and you need energy in your hand. Fire Crystal with 3 copies, you're going to be able to essentially find unlimited energy. There's 12 energy in the deck, which we'll get to a bit later on, which means that you can get 9 of those back with Fire Crystal, and that's usually going to be enough to make sure that you are always able to welder for 2 fire energy onto your active, and then have an attachment as well. So Fire Crystal, a bit of a consistency card here to make things a little bit easier, just to make sure that you don't fall into the trap of not having the energy in hand.
And just in general, it's really strong to get energy from the discard pile rather than the deck. There is obviously ways to get energy from the deck, which we'll talk about later, but if you have energy in the discard and you have energy in the deck and you want to get them from one place or the other, it's almost always correct to get it from the discard pile, just because you want to be able to manually draw into fire energy later on and give yourself some manual attachments, which you can't top deck an energy from the discard, but you can top deck it from the deck. So you always want to have access to energy from your discard pile.
Yeah, exactly. One of the other cool things that Green's ReshiZard can do, since you have a lot of space, is you can play 2 copies of Reset Stamp. And the best thing is, you're really unlikely to discard them, so realistically, you're going to be able to stamp twice in your matchups. I don't actually think that there's any way that you could discard them unless you choose to with our big oven. So you might be able to maybe give yourself a couple of turns at the end of the game. Maybe you stamp your opponent to 4 after they kill a second Volcanion, hoping that they brick. They don't. They kill a ReshiZard. You can stamp them to 1 and hope that the effect sticks there.
And not only are you almost never going to have to discard stamp, but you're almost never not going to have it when you want it either, because obviously we are playing greens, which is allowing you to search for stamp when you need it. So as long as you have stamps in your deck, which you almost always will, because you're not going to be discarding them, you're going to be able to get them at the perfect time to screw over your opponent as much as possible.
Certainly will. And another card that might potentially screw your opponent over is 1 copy of Choice Helmet. This is kind of our interesting little tech, one of those cards that I've put in. The reason I've put it in here is because the only real threat that you face with ReshiZard is one of your Reshiram Charizard getting 1 shot really early. Because the last thing you want to do is spend all this time powering up a ReshiZard only for it to get knocked out by like a Mew Mew copying a Dragonite GX's attack, or maybe an Ultra Necrozma who has way too many energy on it. So a Choice Helmet just means that those Pokemon need to get a little bit more out of their attacks. Ultra Necrozma can get there, but 300 damage is really, really hard for it to do. And Mew Mew, if it's attacking with Dragonite GX, is realistically not likely to ever get there, so Choice Helmet could potentially be a good little tech. It also means as well that those big GX Pokemon that might be trying to half hit you are going to be a little bit more inconvenienced by your healing cards, because sometimes like a giant potion won't be a big deal, but with the extra 30 damage that they haven't done, maybe you can get out of 2-hit range.
Certainly can, and I would say that one of the matchups that the Choice Helmet is even more important for is probably something like a Pikarom matchup, where not only would they already need 3 E-Powers to take a knockout with a Tag Bolt, they would now need 4 if there's a Choice Helmet in the active to take a 1-hit KO on an undamaged ReshiZard. But there's also the more recently popular Raichu Tag Team, which can do 250 damage for 5 energy, which is probably going to be Pikarom players' main strategy for dealing with a ReshiZard. But if you've got a Choice Helmet, you're going to force them not only to find 5 energy on the active, but they're going to need double E-Power to take the 1-hit KO on the ReshiZard as well. So it's a very strong card matchup, I would say.
It certainly is. Can you hear my cat in the background there, Jordan?
Oh, a little bit.
A little bit. She's saying hello. She wants to be on the video, but she's been locked out of the room. Finally, we move on to our stadiums. We have 2 copies of Giant Furnace in our list to help us find energy when we need them. Like we were saying, you want to make sure that your welders are for maximum value, and your big oven is going to be able to do that. You can search out this card with greens, like every card in the deck essentially, and it means that if it stays in play for a couple of turns, you might actually get quite a lot of value out of it. You might ask why this over something like Fiery Flint. The Fiery Flint obviously giving you 4 energy, whilst discarding 2, so it's essentially saying we're having a bit of a gamble here, going, well, I'm happy to just do it once and get the 2 energy. Maybe I get it twice, it's the same effect, but if I get it 3 times and my opponent doesn't remove it, then I've essentially drawn half of the energy in my deck and my welders are super, super potent. So it's a bit of a gamble, but when it pulls off, it seems pretty good to me.
It seems fine either way to me, whether you play this card or a Fiery Flint. They both serve the same purpose overall, but in general, it's kind of just nice having extra stadium cards in play right now, because there are a lot of decks that are having pretty important stadiums in play at the moment, so just having extra resources to win a stadium roar is never a bad thing.
Yeah, talking about that, we have 3 more stadium cards. 2 of them are Power Plant. This one's obviously to lock out things like Mew Mew from being able to attack. They've got their ability that they won't be able to use with Power Plant down, and things like Dedenne GX also can't draw cards. If you can play this down at the right time, you can potentially lock out your entire opponent's deck from working. Another deck that really struggles with Power Plant sometimes is Pikarom, because they lose their free retreat. I could potentially also see this card being, instead of Power Plant, being Lysander Labs in order to turn off things like Shedinja or even spell tags from Giratina, but it depends what you think the meta's going to be, whether you think Mew Mew's going to be big or whether you think Giratina's going to be big, as to which one you'd play. Both have their merits. We've chosen Power Plant here because it's just generally a little bit safer.
Yeah, Lysander Labs is certainly a decent option because a lot of people think of Power Plants as a pretty average card now that Zoroark GX has been rotated. But when you think about it, there's actually quite a few decks that Power Plant really annoys quite a bit. Not only the ones that you already mentioned, but there's also decks like the recently featured Dark Box with Zoro Ninja, and that shuts off Weavile GX's ability, which is a pretty crucial ability to that deck. And even more recent things, like we've started to see some disruption decks like Keldeo GX popping up with its Safeguard-like ability. Obviously, you've already got Double Blaze to go through effects, but having an extra out to that certainly isn't a bad thing.
Yeah, Power Plant does have a lot of niche effects that you sometimes don't really think about. Our final stadium is, of course, Heat Factory Prism. You can't play a fire deck without Heat Factory. Being able to draw 3 extra cards means that you are more likely to draw into the things that you want, and you don't mind if 1 or 2 fire energy go into the bin. You got Fire Crystal, so you're going to be able to get them back. It's a pretty strong card. It's obviously going to be included in every fire deck from here until the end of time. Definitely a good inclusion.
And in this deck specifically, it's extra important because it's probably the strongest draw card in this list, which is kind of weird to say, but because you've got 4 other stadiums in the deck, it's getting pretty easy to win a stadium war a lot of the time. So if you time it right, you can potentially have the Heat Factory in play for a high percentage of a game. And with the 3 copies of Fire Crystal, which is potentially a little higher than usual, you're going to be able to pull off Heat Factory with relative ease without being too worried about running out of resources.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be a good card to give you what you want when you need it, and since you've got so much search with greens, you're not necessarily worried about discarding it sometimes. You can just get rid of it and replace it with a stadium that's more useful for you at the time, because you're probably going to win the stadium war with 5 stadiums. There's not many other decks out there that are going to be playing that many. Onto our energy, we obviously have 12 fire energy. This is probably the optimal amount. Like, they swing between 11 and 12, these lists sometimes. I'm not entirely sure which way I would prefer to go, but 12 seems to work reasonably well. It gives you the best outs to draw one in your opening hand with a Volcanion, and it also means that there's plenty in deck to be able to search with and welder onto your ReshiZard.
Yeah, I'd say the main reason that 12 is good is just so that you can use cards like Flare Starter Turn 2 to suck a bunch of energy out of your deck and then still not struggle to draw into them when you want them, because it's all well and good to search your deck for 3 energy, but if you start to run out of attachments, then it kind of doesn't seem worth it anymore. So having the slightly high count allows you to kind of make use of your Flare Starters and your Welders in the early game, get a whole bunch of energy out of your deck, and then still make sure you've got enough for manual attachments in the late game.
Yeah, because remember, you are going to try and have 6 of those 12 energy attached to a ReshiZard on turn 2, so it's going to be difficult to find them after that first turn. But hey, there you go, that's the list. Obviously, our lists at the moment are geared towards doing the thing we want them to do consistently, so there are obviously changes that we might be able to make. You could cut down on Giant Potion, maybe you don't like that particular build as much, maybe you want to add in some tech cards along the way, like the Surge that we were talking about. There's definite options and ways that you can change this list, and because you've got greens, those one-of cards that you might not include in other decks, you can probably get away with here.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of cool tech item cards or supporter cards that you can play in this deck just because of the way they synergize with greens. But even tech Pokemon, if you ever want to have another attacker besides ReshiZard, isn't a bad idea. Some people play the Eevee Snorlax GX still because it is nice to have a decent tag team attacker that isn't weak to water, but for the most part, you don't really need any of those cards. It's kind of just choosing which cards you feel like taking for a specific tournament.
Yeah, exactly. And you could even include Mew Mew in this list as well. considering the only Pokemon that you'd realistically be attacking with is ReshiZard, but hey, it's up to you. This is the list that we've got at the moment. Feel free to change as you wish. Anyway, thanks Jordan for coming along and talking through this one with me.
No problem.
And thanks everyone for watching. If you like the content, then consider subscribing by clicking the save line in the middle of the screen. On the left-hand side, we have some videos that YouTube thinks that you'll like, and on the right, we have our Unified Minds Worlds Testing playlist. As on the day of recording, by the way, Jordan, we've actually just hit 800 subscribers, which is crazy to me that so many people are willing to waste their time listening to us talk about Pokemon. So a big thanks to everyone who has subscribed, and hopefully we can get to that magical 1,000 pretty soon.
How exciting.
Oh, it's so exciting. Anyway, now that I've completely ruined the 20 seconds at the end, click on those things now. Anyway, we'll see you all next time for more from the Sableyes. Bye.